So now we have two speakers, Brian Arthur, who is an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute, and a Nanyang visiting professor. I wrote a little bit more about him. He's a world authority on technology and financial markets. He's also one of the founding fathers of the Santa Fe Institute, and he has been one of the main sources of inspiration to Paralimes, which is one of the organizing institutes for this session. He's Irish and he lived for more than 40 years in the United States. Anyway, this is all I want to say. I now invite Brian to be our first speaker, and I wish you a very good afternoon.
Thank you very much. It may be a bit too loud. There's quite an echo. Just make sure you are comfortable with that. I'm delighted to be here. I feel I'm very much among friends. I have met many of you. I know many of you. I'll be talking today about 10 to the 3, which is 1,000 years. Jan Wassbinder originally invited me, and I wondered why. You know, he said, "Brian, would you talk about 10 to the 3? And privately, I was too polite to say, is this because you think I've been around most of those years? I haven't. I could say 10 to the 2 might be more accurate. Anyway, I'll be talking about the last 1,000 years, and I must say I thought this was going to be fairly easy until I sat down and tried to figure out what had happened in the last 1,000 years. I'm still not 100% sure, but I want to give you a story today that's mostly around technology. My co-speaker, Sandra van der Loo, who is an archaeologist, will take us back much further than this. So I'm going to give you the recent story only of the last 1,000 years. Sandra told me this morning he's going to start at a million years back and then work our way up. So I'm giving you a narrower story. Sandra will give you a much wider story, talking also about culture and how humanity itself has evolved in that time. This is left one. Can't get either one to work. Which one? That one. All right. So I'd call this the emergence of technology and human evolution. But then I thought later when I was preparing the talk, actually I'm just looking at one question. How did we as humans become modern? And if you like to see this more pictorially, this is an image. I think it's the city of Kaifeng in China, about 1100. So this is 900 or more years ago. And I just took that as a fairly developed place for the time with lots of technologies. Here's a horizontal water wheel and a mill here, etc. If you look into these, this is a rather gorgeous piece of art. And if you look into that, you will see an enormous amount of human life, but it's highly organized. It's highly concentrated, it's very civilized, and it's quite technological for its time. And yet, nowadays, we would look at something like this and we'd just simply say, got it, you know, but this is town life, village life 1,000 years ago, about as advanced as anywhere in the world, but very different from this. Oop. This is Shanghai, current age, and as far as I'm concerned, I think this is one of the most amazing cities I've ever been in. I haven't been there for about 10 years, but I looked at the skyline of Shanghai and I thought, this dwarfs New York. It's extraordinarily modern. It's something that we in the West can look to and just go, oh my God, you know, this is modernity taken to an extreme. If you like a different image, This is a place I visited about 3 years ago. It's the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland and France. It's CERN. And that is just one small element of the collider. This is the detector. You can see little human beings here and there. They're not very large. This here is about the size of a cathedral, and yet this is just one element. So my question then is, how did we get from this to this, or if you prefer, to that? This is highly technological. It's the biggest piece of technology, a single piece of technology in the world. If you like clockwork, if you like electronics, if you like high tech, this is as big and as complicated as it gets. It's basically throwing around particles at close to the speed of light, round and round and round, and accelerating them all the time. So I want to just ask this question, I keep harping on it. How on earth did we get from here to there? And for me, when I began to think about this a few days ago or last week, I realized this is a wonder. In some sense, it's a miracle, because if you manage to go back in a time machine to Kaifeng around 1100 and you were there, oxes and carts, water wheels, the whole thing, and somebody came down from Mars or wherever, came down from heaven and said, hey, you know something? In 900 years' time, you would not believe what China's going to look like, what Europe or America is going to look like. You will not believe the technologies. They'd probably say to you, I'm not sure what you're talking about. Anyway, what is technology? You know, we have a few machines here, but how would that develop in 900 years? So I believe this is a miracle. I think the more I look at it, I see an awful lot of happenstance. It's not clear why this should have happened, why we should have developed so rapidly. It's not clear that it should have happened at all. And what I want to talk about here is how it did happen. So my question is, what on earth happened? It's, let me say right away that it's a subtle story. It's not just a story about technology, as we'll see when Sandra talks shortly. It's a story about culture, it's a story about ideas, it's a story about society, it's a story about multiple societies, it's a story about the transfer of information from one end of Eurasia to the other, from top to bottom. It's a story above all of humanity, and it's to some small degree also a story about science, but I want to harp on that science is not the biggest deal here. So we'll see this in a moment. Also, if it's about technology, we have this idea, what is technology? Where does it come from? Oh yeah, it comes from geniuses, and these geniuses make inventions, so we must have become modern by invention after invention after invention. There's a bit of truth to that, but only a bit of truth, as we're going to see. I want to start quite arbitrarily. In the year 1411, could have started in 1421. There's a fashionable argument at the moment. I've read this 4 or 5 different times. Somebody who's a historian, this is Neil Ferguson, who's British, I'd say Scottish, he would say British. He's been at Oxford, you know. So this is Neil Ferguson, a very good historian, and he starts by asking this question. Suppose you are somewhere in the world in 1411 or 1421, somewhere in there, and you're going to make a bet. Person descends from Mars, tells you, world's going to be modern pretty soon, 500 years' time, 600 years' time. It'll be unbelievable. There are large hadron colliders. Shanghai will be a shining city, etc. all countries would be modern, but where would you bet on that's going to bring this about? And so this is quite a fashionable question at the moment. The obvious answer in 1411 would be China. China was very highly developed. During this Sung dynasty, they had had a renaissance. They were the most advanced technologically in the world. They were very advanced indeed culturally. They were advanced in courtly manners and poetry, etc., and had been for several thousand years. So if you were in Asia, you would probably say, I bet on China is going to bring us modernity. India, also a pretty good bet. India was very sophisticated and had been for a long time. Indian mathematics had flourished between 0 AD and 1100 or 1400. They were the people who invented the zero. They had invented a lot of modern mathematics, picked stuff up from the Greeks, brought it to India, brought that back to the Arabs. So India could have been a bet. What about the Arabs? They had a staggeringly complicated view of the world. They had Arabic science that had developed over the previous 500 years or longer. People tend to ignore the Arabs in the history of science, but look at words like zenith, like nadir. These are words that are Arabic. Algebra, algorithm. These are all Arabic words. Something like 40 to 50% of the stars in the sky that are named have Arabic names. There's a star called Betelgeuse in English, but it's Bet al-Chus, house of something or other in Arabic. So the Arabs could have been a fantastic contender. They had brought a lot of civilization up into Spain and from there to France. Persia. Persia is not to be discounted, and if you're a betting person, you would say, well, Persia, incredible art, incredible poetry. Persia is not where Iran is just now. It was a sprawling empire to some degree then. But you might have put your money on Persia. And then the same Martian comes along and says, okay, I've taken all your money. Some people are betting on China. Some are betting on Persia, some on the Arabs. But actually, there's another region, the top left-hand corner of Eurasia, where all those smelly people are, 1411. There's not much hygiene. You can't really walk through the streets. You're knee-deep in mud, horse manure, all kinds, not just horse manure as well, other types of fertilizers. You're knee-deep in stuff. They've had the Black Plague, the bubonic plague in the 1340s. It's not very highly developed, yet that was the place more than anywhere else on earth that catapulted us into modernity. And this is a big puzzle, or at least Neil Ferguson shows it's a puzzle. By the way, I want to say a word about him. He's a very smart guy. And I think he's the original guy that the British have a category of academic they call a teledon. A don is a professor. A teledon is a professor who appears regularly on television. And then if you're an extreme regular on television, you become something like this, very smart, but every Saturday night you're on some show or other, Sunday morning. I don't want to disparage this man. He is a very good historian. Here's what he says. He's got a book called Civilization, which I'm calling modernity here. And he's basically saying what happened in the west of Europe. And he says, well, it was 6 different things that brought us modernity. He calls them killer apps. He says 6 killer apps here. One is competition science, property rights, medicine, consumer society, and a work ethic, very strong work ethic. And I read all this and I sort of think, yeah, it's all true. And then I thought, well, hang on a moment. And, you know, I think very hard about this stuff and I realize, but there's one thing he left out of his list that is much bigger than all of these combined, and that's technology. More than anything else, it's technology that separates us from this time in 1400. If you take all our technologies away, you take away television, you take away modern housing, you take away cars, modern factories, go back. All you have to do is take away all these technologies and suddenly you're back in the Middle Ages. And if you're back at this period, 1411, there was a lot of technology. People knew how to make cathedrals in the west of Europe, and these were very sophisticated. But it wasn't distinguishing Europe from the rest of the world at that time. So really, the thing that he should have put number one here is technology. And about the time this came out, I was writing a book called The Nature of Technology. And as I researched technology, and my training is as an engineer and mathematician, I realized that technology was a sort of ugly sister, at least in Europe and the US. Technology, and don't listen to this if you're from Nanyang Technological Institute. If it were somewhere else, it might be called Nanyang Applied Scientific Institute or something. But technology in Europe, and especially in Britain, is a kind of ugly sister. I remember being at a meeting about 15 years ago. Somebody says, English is, Brian, what's your background? And I said, I'm trained as an engineer. And the guy said, where's your oily rag? Technology doesn't get much respect. It doesn't have the prestige of science. It doesn't have the prestige of mathematics. And the idea is that if you're not bright enough to go into physics and you're not bright enough to do mathematics, there's still hope. You can go into engineering. So technology has been ignored. And yet, I want to argue here that that's the main factor that caused this change. These aren't quite wrong, and this development towards modernity, or the creation of modernity, does have these elements in it. You could say, why did these other parts of the world not develop into what we call the modern world to any degree like we have in Western Europe? A large answer would be because many of them were centrally controlled. The whole idea of innovation anywhere in the world at just about any time is negative. Innovation, we don't want that. Why? That would upset the established order. Innovation, I'm the emperor, I'm the central government. No, thank you. We don't want that. We might lose control. Europe had many small principalities. It had many tiny little governances. There was a central power called the Christian Church or the Catholic Church, but it couldn't control that much. And much of Europe had princes who wanted military technology so they could fight wars against each other. They encouraged innovation. They mightn't have called it that. That's a rather new word. But they would have said, yeah, we want better armaments. We want better military machines. So there was a great deal of competition. But yet medicine, for example, I could go down this list and say, did medicine bring modern life? No. Medicine was rather useless in prolonging life until about 1910 or 1920. You go into a hospital in the West, in America, or in Europe in 1900, your chances of coming out of hospital alive are not as good as had you stayed at home and gone through the disease there. It wasn't modern science or modern medicine that prolonged our lives. It was the coming of sewage systems, an engineering thing, and the coming of clean water supplies around 1880 to 1900 that allowed people to live longer. Medicine only started to develop, Western medicine anyway, in terms of saving lives after 1900, particularly after the coming of sulfa drugs, penicillin, 1930s and 40s up till modern days. So, I don't want to harp too long, but the killer apps are not quite killer apps. There is one killer app, and that's technology. Technology itself, I want to mention here, at least in passing, that we think of technology as bringing progress, but up until about 1800, all over the world, there's very little idea of progress. Most people think, well, I'm here. My grandparents were here too. Yes, what we work with, the type of plow or something, has changed a little bit. But, you know, is that progress? Things change, things get worse. There are good seasons, there's bad seasons. Had I been born 500 years ago, it probably would have been much the same. If I'm born in 500 years' time, it'll still be much the same. The idea of progress is new. It's quite Western, and it arises around 1800. So let me go back and go through some of this just on a timeline here. Starting arbitrarily, this is here, this piece of, this picture itself is from, I was trying to guess the time, but it's 1240. The place is France. There are all these rather cute-looking people working away. The technology is quite advanced. They have ladders, they have mallets, they have brick and mortar. There's mortar up here as well. They have pulley systems. If you look, this guy is on a treadmill. He's turning the crane that pulls up the tiles or the bricks and probably the cement as well. Meanwhile, over here, there's medical technology. On the left side, that's someone who is dearly departed here, probably hasn't been saved by the doctor, and the doctor isn't feeling very good about it, and is about to cover this person up. Hovering over the whole thing is heaven. Clouds, cherubims, maybe God or Jesus Christ, can't quite see. And then above that again is the church. So this is a pretty good metaphor. Everybody's toiling away down below. Yes, they have technology. The technology isn't remarkable. Hovering it over everything and all important, above and below is the church, is heaven. And it's all about just hanging in there in this life, and then heaven will be the reward. I'm quite impressed. I think this is pretty good technology. It's not remarkable. It's certainly no better than would have been in China at the time. China was much more advanced, or India, places like that. But the point I want to make here is Europe didn't start with a blank slate. There was an awful lot known, even, say, in the 1200s. Moving forward, the next development in Europe that's of any interest whatever is printing. And this started out in Mainz in Germany. Gutenberg, who came up with the printing press. Now there'll be a Q&A afterwards, and feel free to ask me how invention works, but it sure doesn't work by Mr. Gutenberg sitting down and saying, I want to develop printing. Hang on, I'll sit in this chair, or I'll take a bath, or I'll have a shower, whatever people do, and go like that and say, oh my God, yes, we need movable type. It doesn't work that way. It's usually a very smooth development. Someone like Gutenberg might get a word in his ear. And one principle I want to mention is that we heavily underestimate how much commerce or interchange of ideas there was throughout history between the East and the West. Very much, many ideas going from China through the Silk Road, somewhere to the Middle East, spreading out to the rest of the world from there, especially from the Middle East. The west of Europe went to conquer the Middle East during the Crusades. I don't think they did very much that was useful. That's my opinion. They may have spread something or other, Christianity or maybe diseases or whatever they spread. But they brought back ideas that actually caused a mini industrial revolution in the 1100s and 1200s in the west of Europe. And they brought ideas back chiefly from the Arabs and some of the ideas from China, including the idea of movable type and the idea of paper. Paper came about in Europe in 1350 or so. China had known paper much earlier than that. The idea of printing with movable type was known in China and used in China as early as 860 to print one of the Buddhist sutras. It didn't work very well for China because there's so many characters. So if you have 2,000 or 3,000 characters and you make movable type pieces out of each of those, it wasn't very convenient. So for many centuries and many years after that, in China, people found it more convenient just to write in the normal way using normal calligraphy. Europe was much better. We have an alphabet of 26 words or 26 letters or so, plus a few more symbols. And Gutenberg's idea was that if you made solid type, maybe from molds, and the typefaces were made of, say, lead, you could put them all together, squeeze them together, ink the surface, and then press that onto something. So that's what you're seeing happen here. There's the press. But notice here, this is quite sophisticated. That's some sort of lever and a screw type system. So it's actually producing a lot of leverage and therefore a lot of force here. Here, probably this is ink. This is the guy that's going to ink the type surface. This is the person that's setting up these a type setter. The year, I don't know, but my guess is, 1560, 1580, quite early on. What I want to point out with this, now we're still in Europe, and Europe is no more advanced than anywhere else in the world still at this time, and probably less advanced, but it has this one, what I'd call a body of technology. That whole body of technology, you'd say, well, it's just one invention, it's trivial, does it matter? Yes, it made a huge difference. And the difference it makes, and this is what strikes me, we tend to think of technologies as individual technologies. They come along, people purchase them, or they use them. It's like a better plowshare or something. That improves matters, and then something else invented. But actually, this made a huge, huge, huge difference. I started to look into the printing revolution systematically about 10 years ago, and I discovered there are about 3 books by historians. I looked in Neil Ferguson's book, not mentioned. I looked in McNeil's book. Printing isn't mentioned. Yet, this is the biggest technology with consequences of the last 1,000 years. So I'll repeat that. This is the biggest deal in the last 1,000 years that you could print. Why? Before printing comes along, and let's say you can read, not that many people could read. The people who were taught to read were not always taught to write, because the church thought it's okay to read the Gospels, it's okay to read these tracts, it's okay to read whatever manuscripts you can, but we don't want anyone to think or write down anything that could be subversive. So, But if you wanted to read something, you befriended an abbot. You went to your local monastery. The monastery had a library. You requested some vellum thing or maybe some book. And that would be brought out. It would be chained to a desk. You could look at this thing chained to the desk. That way you couldn't walk off with it or steal it. You might or might not be allowed to copy it. But notice that all information prior to Gutenberg's invention was internal to the church. The church controlled just about all information. When printing comes along, suddenly information goes beyond the church. It's not owned anymore, it's external. And that means anybody who could afford it and who could read could buy a book. If you could buy the book and read the book, you could discuss it with your friends. You could discuss it with other people. You could write letters to other people who could read, or if you could write, and you could discuss those ideas. So by the time 1492 that Christopher Columbus is heading off to look for India or whatever he was looking for, it's actually, he had several copies of books that he studied before from scholars who thought that if you kept sailing west, you might find land. And their reasoning, by the time Copernicus is trying to think about how planets work, Copernicus has been reading publicly available books. So this thing was one enormous killer app, if you want a killer app. This, as you know, is Martin Luther, comes along about 1520. He was not that well known, but what he was able to do was to print up his views, and this is all in German, im Jahre, 1522. So this is actually supposed to be the Pope here, and this is the people on the Protestant side or the Luther side, and they're going to engage in a bowling game with the Pope in this thing. This was the only Lutheran tract that I could find on the internet that wasn't lewd. Most of them showed the Pope as some animal, it showed the Pope as the devil, etc., and it got a lot worse than that. I looked it up, and Luther managed to put his views out on these small posters, tracts, pamphlets. By the time Luther was finished with doing this, around 1530, he had 2 million copies in Germany, which hadn't a large population out there. So printing suddenly brought along Protestantism or Luther's ideas. That wouldn't be that terribly important, but what I want to point out to you is, what sort of ideas were those? What Luther was talking about, forget the theology, what Luther was talking about was the idea that you didn't have to take all truth from the church, that we were individually rational, we could come to our own ideas of God, of course, as circumscribed by Luther and the Protestants. You could get your own ideas of God, but notice the movement here is from authority, top down, to individuality and rationality. And this became an attitude that was old in Europe. The Greeks had brought this in. The Romans had that to some degree, but mostly very Greek idea. And then this comes to the fore with printing. It had been hatching, though, since the 1200s in Europe. Here is, I should also mention that this printing accelerated the Renaissance greatly as well, the rediscovery of Roman and Greek literature, Roman and Greek ideas, Roman and Greek relics, etc., which brought a lot of ancient thinking and rational thinking and ordered thinking into Europe, discovery of Aristotle. the spreading of ideas in the 1480s of Plato's ideas. These all came in, but they were printed up, and suddenly Europe had something to discuss. This is, I'm sure you know, these characters, maybe not. The top left guy is René Descartes, and the middle guy is Galileo, obviously, and at the right we have Isaac Newton. Descartes, I think, is pivotal. Newton gets a lot of the credit for modern science. Galileo is usually mentioned, and Descartes, unless you're French, Descartes isn't that much mentioned. And if you are French, it all arose with Descartes, and everybody else is footnotes on Descartes. So, but what struck me is I've been reading in detail about these characters and the coming of modern science, was that science came late. The whole idea of looking at nature, if you like, systematically in an ordered way, has only been with us really since the late 1500s, or in this case around 1620. And it was systematized by Descartes, Francis Bacon, and others. But if you look at what really is science, where does it arise from? We're still talking about the influence of printing and ideas. Science itself arises, let me take Descartes. He went to school at a school called La Flèche, the Arrow, I think, correct? La Flèche. I think it was Jesuit school in France. But nearby, to Descartes' great delight as a very young kid, were automata. These were moving mechanism figures that would sort of go like that, maybe strike a bell on the hour. Descartes, all his life, was fascinated by mechanism and by automata. In 1618, Descartes meets a Dutchman. I'm not saying that's always a good idea, but meeting Dutchmen. But the Dutchman's name was Isaac Beckman, who's quite obscure in history now. Beckman was the son of somebody who did piping and hydraulics for breweries, and Beckman took that up as his own idea, as his own profession, and he took Descartes on as a kind of apprentice. So Descartes comes on, and Beckman's idea was that everything in nature, if we only understood it, was mechanical. There were small corpuscles, little bits of water, little beads of something or other, like billiard balls. And if you wanted to understand anything in nature, you had to figure out how these minute little particles work. It's a lesson that Descartes learned from Beckman and didn't credit him properly. They fell out, probably Descartes' fault, around 1625. But what I want to point out is that if that is the program of science, how do you describe all these macro phenomena, rainbows, the refraction of light, in terms of micro phenomena? You're basically looking for mechanisms in terms of tiny corpuscles, something that lasted right up to the discovery of photons, light corpuscles. And again, this was very much taken up by Isaac Newton and others. So science, in some sense here, arises out of technology. We tend to think that technology arises out of science. No thanks. It's probably true from about 1900 on. Lee de Forest, for example, had a PhD in physics. He invented the triode vacuum tube, but it didn't mean he had any idea how it worked. A lot of it was experimenting. And it wasn't really until the last century that science begins to truly inform technology. But all the time it was technology that was giving rise to the idea the world is about mechanism, not about much else. Galileo brings me to another point. Galileo is pretty contemporary with Descartes. Galileo's a good physics professor, lives in Pisa, he's teaching there, but he gets wind again of a Dutchman. These Dutch are everywhere. A different Dutchman who had invented something called a spyglass. You could see the enemy 3 miles away. We now call that a telescope. Galileo's really smart. He can't get hold of one. So he figures out how to make one, grinds his own lenses in 1610. He starts to use the telescope and discovers that there are phases of Venus, like the moon, that the moon isn't perfect by any means, it's pockmarked with these craters, that the sun has sunspots, that not everything goes around the earth or the sun. There are little stars, they turn out to be moons going around Jupiter. What I want to point out here is that what Galileo has discovered is a piece of technology, the telescope, and that brings on modern astronomy. Of course, there was plenty known before the telescope and plenty measured, but astronomy and astrology, which were pretty inseparable at the time, arise out of this piece of technology. Meanwhile, Isaac Newton, who's a smart guy, takes all this up, takes all the readings up, takes all the theories of Kepler and others, the whole technological idea, looks for a mechanism and discovers it, and explains planetary motion in 1687. And again, what is there is a mechanism idea. Science is explaining the entire world by using mechanisms like the telescope to describe the world as mechanism. So I want to say it's not just technology that creates the modern world, it's the idea of technology, the idea of mechanism. All this led to a kind of intoxication in Europe that was called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was the idea, some of it inherited from people like Lucretius and some ancients, but very much the idea that the entire universe is ordered, the entire universe is mechanical. It's basically mechanism, it's harmonious. So this was all put in a stanza, Essay on Man, by Alexander Pope, 1733. Now, again, we're 100 years later. All nature is but art unknown to thee. He's really commenting on what Newton had discovered. He doesn't mean nature is art, like it's a piece of oil painting. By art, he means artifice. All nature is mechanism. Artifice is mechanism. All nature is mechanical. If only we knew how, all chance direction which thou canst, all discord, harmony not understood. These are profoundly European ideas. Chinese, very different. They say, yes, it's all harmony, but it's not this ordered harmony. Chinese idea of harmony, I've forgotten the word for it. I can't do it. But Chinese idea of harmony is a bit like riding a bicycle. You're falling off one, you correct, so you're harmonious, you're making your way through life. But in Europe, the whole idea of harmony is things are very ordered, they're very mechanical. Again, this is what I want to point out. All nature is but artifice or mechanism, but we don't always know the mechanism. I wrote this once in a paper, and I think the paper got published with this stanza attributed to Pope Alexander. But it's an English guy, this fellow here, Alexander Pope. He was good friends with Jonathan Swift, Irish guy, etc. And they met to have coffee all the time. So we're in a world where the idea of mechanism has come to the fore, and where people are obsessed with order and mechanism. This led to the idea of Denis Diderot and d'Alembert of putting together an encyclopedia. We'll get all the knowledge in the world. This is 1750 or so. And we'll include technologies. Technologies would have been thought of as artisan technologies. And I got this image. This is what you call a lathe. This guy is turning a crank, 1750, to turn over this lathe. It has a workpiece, and this guy is carving something. So this could be the leg of a chair or something like that. I don't know what the fellow in the background's doing. I wondered about why there was an outer rim that was doing nothing, and then I realized that gives a flywheel effect. I'll come back to this in a moment, but this is 1750. Now, up until 1750, you could have found this sort of technology in China. You could have found it in Persia or Arab cultures. In fact, I've seen this in parts of the Middle East, even in the 1970s, 1980s. Human power, everything very simple, a lathe, it all works. And I would say this is not high tech, this is craft. It's very well produced. But keep in mind, Europe is full of ideas of mechanism, of order, that the world is knowable, that the world is ordered, that everything's harmonious, and that not necessarily an idea of progress, but the world is knowable and ordered. And yet, still by 1750, all of this is still primitive craft. So there's nothing yet distinguishes Europe or brings about real modernity until, I would say, around 1760. You know, you could give or take 20, 30 years. But around 1760, there's a different mood in technology, and that is, if the world is ordered, maybe we can make our technology ordered. Maybe we can make things improved. Maybe we could improve the technologies. Maybe we could make things very precise. And it's this, I don't know if I would call this an idea, it's more like an attitude. This triggers an enormous amount of what you'd call precise interest in improving technologies. And this brings about a raft of new technologies that in turn create the Industrial Revolution, that in turn gives us modernity. I arbitrarily chose this image actually because I thought it was simple looking. But look at this, there's nothing simple. This is Samuel Crompton's mule. It's a spinning machine. It's called a mule because it has two parts. This is a water frame, and then it has a twisting mechanism, which would be a spinner. And because he was bringing two technologies together that didn't really fit together, it was called a mule. He was marrying up two technologies. But what I want to show you is that there's a real difference between this human guy cranking, just one rope here to turn everything, no cogs, no anything, not very precise, but it works extremely well, to this. There's wheels within wheels, there's adjusting mechanisms, there's things that are going up and down. There's probably not any human being cranking the whole thing. It could all be operated by water power or something like that. But things have fundamentally changed. Not quite in those 10 years, 5 years, certainly not that 1 year of 1760, but the whole world pivots, I think, on this particular time. Here's another technology, and that's James Watt's steam engine. Around 1767, which is before this, James Watt was challenged by some professor in Glasgow. Said, "We have this steam engine, it's not very good. Do you mind giving a bit of thought to it?" He was a smart guy. He was mostly a machinist, not trained as a scientist, but but very well trained as a machinist. And he gave a bit of thought to it, and he came up with the idea that, you know, if you introduce steam into a piston, that'll cause a piston to expand. That's all very good. They had that in 1767. But the hard bit was to get the steam out and get the piston to contract. So James Watt on a Sunday is walking along past the village green, he records, and the exact words, and it came to me that, he's in Glasgow, and it came to me that. What came to him was that the steam could be let out a little trap door into a cooled container. Steam goes bump. It suddenly collapses because it's cooled with this extra additional artificially cold container. And steam pressure suddenly collapses and piston goes down. So what he comes up with is a brilliant idea, but it's the Sabbath day and he's Scottish. So he realizes he can't get into his workshop that day to try it out. And the way he writes about it, you can just feel the frustration and the anguish. He has to wait 24 hours to get to his workshop, try it out. It works. The biggest thing in centuries, if you ask me, after printing. This is in a 1781 version. What I want you to notice is look how precise it is, look how precisely detailed it is. There's rockers here, there's a little Watt governor here, there's cranks. Up until James Watt got busy on this, it wasn't thought that you could transfer this rocking motion from the piston into circular motion, because what's going to happen at the bottom of this, etc., what you do is you build a flywheel, etc., and the whole thing keeps going. So we're now in a world of order and high precision. We're in a world where things are engineered and where there is all of a sudden a lot of ideas for improving things. I want to put up two mechanisms here, one or two principles here. One is that all technologies are basically combinations of earlier technologies. So you could go back and if you look, wheels were known, flywheels were known, levers were known, pistons were known, etc. So what James Watt or any other engineer is doing is combining Lego pieces, if you like, to solving some new problem. Secondly, technologies arrive in groups, bodies of technology. So the whole Industrial Revolution depends on these two principles. Once you have a few Lego pieces, you can keep combining them in different ways. That makes a new Lego piece. Once you have one body of technology, another might follow. So you might have all the chemical technologies, say by 1900, but then you might get more engineering technologies or electrical technologies, etc. Those give you new Lego boxes to combine. I want to mention then that if that's the case, if new technologies are combinations of earlier ones, then existing technologies, they become building blocks for yet further technologies. So the real thing behind the Industrial Revolution and the rise of Europe and the rise of England, it's particularly English, the story, at this time, is that there are new Lego pieces coming out, precision engineered, improved over years, and those are thrown back into the Lego box to create yet further technologies. I just threw this in as the idea of combination. This is a train. My guess, looking at the whole thing, is probably it's around 1833, because there's a steam locomotive, so in here is a steam engine, there's wheels, there's cranking devices, there's a chimney, there's a boiler to make the steam. And look at this, there are carriages. To this day, railroad cars in Britain are called carriages. Americans call them cars. but we call them carriages. And those carriages reminded people of like a lady with a very fancy dress, with a train going behind it of material. She'd be walking, and then two or three people might be holding up the train of her dress. Think of a wedding dress or something like that. So people said, oh yes, there's a train of carriages behind the locomotive. Just before this, the locomotive, what moved the train, would have been a horse. The Stockton-Darlington Express was a horse carrying one carriage. But all these pieces existed: carriages, the wheels, the cranks and wheels, the things to keep the coal in, etc. And it's a matter of putting together, as I keep saying, Lego pieces. Every body of technology, as we saw with the printing revolution, creates the economy and society anew. I arbitrarily chose this. It's a picture by Constable, 1819. As roughly, I believe that's precisely the year that Queen Victoria was born. Here, so that's England. It's rural, it's got technologies. If you look somewhere, I think there's a water wheel in this. It's got technologies, horses and carts, and they know what to do. They've got chimneys, etc. It's what you would call bucolic. Very rural, very green, very beautiful. 50 years later, this is England. Not quite the same scene, but that's the degree to which Britain changed. This could be Manchester, it could be Bristol, it could be Birmingham, somewhere like that. But in fact, I grew up in Belfast, which is, I suppose, part of the UK. At least I'm told it is, even if I don't like that. So, and I remember it being like this, all sorts of tall chimneys. This lasted at least up until the 1950s. What I want to impress on you is that this one technology, steam engine, making possible, and textile machines, all put together in factories and fueled by coal, made a landscape like this. It also lifted a lot of people out of poverty, but by about 1850, conditions were rather miserable, and it took many decades to improve after that. I also said that technologies begin to arrive in related bodies, chemical technologies. These are still largely craft technologies. Heavy engineering in the 1880s. Think of those big steel bridges like the Fourth Bridge. Things spread now to Germany and a lot of the rest of Europe, France. Electricity comes along as a set of technologies. They did come out of science. Induction, generating machines, dynamos, electric motors and so on, that all comes along in the 1880s. More and more Lego sets, if you like. Mass production from about 1900 on, reaching its peak around 1940s. Electronics, which is not the same as electricity, the movement of electrons, from really seriously from about 1930 on, with a lot of predecessors before that. Digital technologies, that's a form of electronics early on, and then telecommunications, and then in our own time, genomics. I could add nanotech. But let me very quickly just show you some slides here. That is, I'm reckoning that would be 1915 plus or minus a year. They're making fuses. It's during the First World War. Woolwich Arsenal, that's outside London. And what I want to point out is that running this entire factory, still at that time, is a gigantic steam machine, a steam motor, probably in the basement because it'd be extraordinarily heavy, with cranking around one axle, and then everything was fed off. If you look at these pulleys, everything was fed off that central piece of power. 10 years later, there'd be individual electric motors here. So this isn't mass production. This looks to me like 2 or 3 people at a time working on one small machine here, a bit like a sewing machine size at least. Not quite mass production. 30 years later, I wondered about this. I thought that's clearly Second World War. Turns out it's 1945. It's Boeing. It's actually the Boeing, let me make sure I get this right, Boeing B-32. I thought it could be a B-29 or something. It's B-32, but this is mass production. This is how much everything's changed from here to here in 30 years. Somewhere around here or a bit earlier, everything goes worldwide. Singapore, China, Egypt, India would have picked up this sort of technology, train technology, electric motors, everything's worldwide. People get educated in standard engineering and electrical engineering. And by this time, many countries in the world could do this sort of thing, but this is categorically American. Americans are incredible at organizing technology. I'm not an American, so I'm just saying that as a European. Again, I'm trying to date this one, but I would guess that this is from here, actually, 1973, 1974. It turns out that they're demonstrating a type of army computer that came in several generations. This is the first generation, all sorts of vacuum tubes. Next generation, a good deal smaller, fewer vacuum tubes, more compact still. How do I get rid of that? Just a moment. Okay. All right. Oh. Yeah, it should be all right. Yeah, here we go. Anyway, and then this is an integrated circuit which was invented by Intel near where I live in 1971. I can remember this sort of thing. So this is probably 1973, 74. Let me finish up here with so modernity, the way I'm talking about it, is not just a succession of technologies, it's a succession of bodies of technology changing the economy and thereby changing society. But it doesn't just come about by lonely inventors working in some attic. It comes about by seeing the world as ordered, seeing the world as mechanical, seeing the world as harmonious and ordered, which is a thread that goes right through from the Greeks, seeing everything as individual, looking at all phenomena and breaking that into mechanisms. So it's also an attitude. I want to finish here by asking a question. Obviously here technology has evolved, and ever since Darwin's day, people have been asking, is a theory of evolution for technology possible? In fact, Samuel Butler, I don't know if you've heard of him in English. Samuel Butler's grandfather ran a school. I've forgotten the grandfather's name, but he ran, obviously Butler. He ran a school where Darwin was a pupil as a small boy. Then Samuel Butler's dad, if I recall correctly, was a bishop and rather heavy-handed. So good old Samuel Butler took off for New Zealand around about 1859. There followed a copy of Theory of Evolution, Darwin's Theory of the Origin of Species, published in 1859, followed on the heels of Samuel Butler, arrived in New Zealand about 2-3 years later. Samuel Butler in New Zealand reads this thing, he says, oh my God, animals evolve, human beings have evolved, there's a theory of evolution, could there be such a theory for machines? Could we have steam engines interbreeding and bringing out new species and so on? He writes this essay and he calls it Darwin Among the Machines. There isn't such a theory, but people have speculated over a long period, since Darwin's book, has technology actually evolved by having ancestors of technologies, and then maybe they come together, they're brought together, and there's variations among, say, trains, and then maybe the best one of that evolves into something else. It turns out it's not satisfactory. Here's the way it really works, and at least according to me, novel technologies are constructed from existing technologies, also from capturing novel phenomena. For chemical technology, it's capturing some chemical principle. Fair enough. And these offer themselves, as I said, these new technologies become components or building blocks for the construction of still further technologies. In that sense, the whole body of technology creates itself. In our context, I don't want to be too categorical, but I would say up until 1760, Europe would have been interchangeable with a lot of sophisticated cultures in the world, China, India, wherever, Middle East. What really differentiates Europe and causes the Industrial Revolution is an emphasis on improving technologies by putting together pieces of technology to create new technologies. Once you have trains, you can start to put together technologies that use trains. Once you have trains, you want to know when a train's going to arrive in a station. So that creates a very heavy demand for what came to be called the telegraph, wiring from one station to the next, say, this train is delayed, or this train's on its way, etc. So technologies lead to further technologies. In this sense, technology creates itself. One last slide, and I thought I was being very clever. I cooked up this idea. I demonstrated it in the lab. That's another story. And I wrote it up in a book called The Nature of Technology, what it is and how it evolves. And then I found this. William Fielding Ogburn is an American sociologist. Here he's writing about 1922, a book he called Social Change. But it's the same idea. He says, he's asking this question. He was an expert on the Trobriand Islands, and he said, how come these people, as he called them at the time, savages, we wouldn't use that word now, we'd say less developed people or culture, how come it has less developed technology than we have? And he hits it on the head. He says, it would seem that the larger the equipment of material culture, in other words, the more technologies there are, the greater the number of inventions, the more there is to invent with, the greater will be the number of inventions. And he goes on to say, the streetcar could have not been invented from the material culture existing at the last glacial period. The discovery of the power of steam and the mechanical technology made possible a large number of inventions. In other words, what happened in Europe, above all, was not just inventions, but was inventions making building blocks available for yet further inventions. Once you have the steam engine, that becomes a component in many other technologies, which become components in factories, which become components in yet further technologies. So my answer to how the world became modern is that technology itself is like a vast self-creating chemistry. Simple molecules make more complicated molecules. Those more complicated molecules can combine into still more complicated molecules, all the way up to the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva. Technologies tend to arrive in groups. We have genomic technologies to do with genes and proteins. We have nanotech to do with very small with molecular size machines, etc. And those give us new Lego sets to create yet more with. And these create and keep creating and recreating the society and economy we live in. All this kind of broke out in Europe from 1760 until the present day. From about 1800, it brought the whole idea of progress, at least in Europe. By Jane Austen's time, it's not just going through life, dying, and then the next generation. It's the whole idea that society is progressing, we're living longer, we're healthier, we're better off, maybe. And that's a questionable thing in itself. And then all of that quickly from about 1800, 1850 to 1900 and on into the 1900s goes abroad. And you get modern Shanghai, you get all kinds of technologies. I do not want to say that nothing was happening in the rest of the world. Yes, of course, but the story I'm giving is how Europe became modern and how that spread all over the world. And it's a story of building blocks being combined to make further building blocks, to make further building blocks, and then suddenly with something very modern. Last comment I want to make here is that science really only enters around 1850. I started to look at the history of making dams. That was craft until 1850, and then people started to diagram forces and look at parabolic cross-sections and things like that. But technology precedes science, technology gives birth to science, science itself is applied technology, and then from about 1850, 1900, especially 1940s, 50s, suddenly science is able to inform technology. And that unearths or excavates phenomena in genetics or genomics, in nanotech, phenomena in electricity and electronics. Science understands these phenomena and shows us how to make technologies out of them, but it's very recent. So, yes, Europe became modern roughly late 1700s, 1800s, 1900s. The rest of the world followed. Science didn't lead that, but science benefited from it. And then in the last 50 to really my lifetime, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, science is informing technology. None of this has to do with lone inventors. Well, a little bit of it, like James Watt, but it's usually people seeing how to make an improvement, how to put something together in teams or otherwise. Thank you.